started. Thank you everyone so much for coming, those who are here with us in person and a bunch of people on Zoom. Thank you so much for the EALL talk series, the colloquium series hosted by the East Asian Languages and Literatures Department. And we are really excited to feature local poet Wing-Pik Lam. And this event is co-sponsored by the Center for Chinese Studies. We thank the Center and the CQE grant for supporting the Center speaker series on Chinese heritage in Hawaii, connections, contestations, and collaborations, of which Wing-Pik Lam is the first speaker. And they have very generously sponsored a spread to be enjoyed after the talk around 4, so please stick around to have some lemon bars and cookies and speak with our author. I'll introduce Wing-Pik. So Wing-Pik Lam is a Honolulu businessman and poet, as you all know. Bamboo Ridge Press has published 3 collections of his poetry, Expounding the Doubtful Points, published in 1987, the Nanjing Massacre Poems, 2012, and The Old Timers, which is the newly released book that you can buy at the back there and which Wing-Pik will be reading from and talking about today. So without much further ado, Wing-Pik, thank you.
At dusk. The tabby cat has made her usual rounds, but these days are shorter now, as she keens the darkness coming sooner. She hugs the walls and sneaks across the alleyway, one lone meteor rushing headlong home. Behind the restaurant, amid lengthening shadows, the cashier beats an empty can with his spoon, calling her to a dinner of leftover fish heads, their gelatinous eyes a shimmer of pearls, promising a succulent return to the primal sea. The cook inside fires up his wok, deeply patinaed, stir-frying slices of pork belly and vegetables, then adding a dollop of his secret shrimp paste, this tiny seed quickly blossoming into a bouquet, permeating the courtyard as the light recedes. The old-timer hanging his threadbare wash revels in the savory aroma of this serendipity. In the gloaming, he breaks out into song, his taut line of bleach-white clothes pegs paddling in unison into the gathering wind. On the balcony, a prostitute hums along, recalling the folk melodies of her childhood before silvery moons waxed and waned. She sips from the restorative tea of her reverie, reluctant to leave when her shift begins. The baker has spied on her from his window, but he breaks away as this is time for his early bed. He sleeps through the violins rehearsing next door, his snores a chorus to their 2-stringed melancholies. He will wake up refreshed before the cocks crow. What I just read is my pipe dream of what the streets of Honolulu Chinatown might have been like around the year 1900. I think it is an appropriate introduction to my book, The Old Timers, which is exclusively set in the Chinese community of that time. But before I read any more poems, I want to thank the Department of East Asian Languages and Literature and the Center for Chinese Studies for sponsoring this reading. In fact, you have already heard some of what I will be reading before, about 4.5 years ago. In the week just before we went into lockdown for COVID in 2020, I read here under the same sponsorship, giving you a progress report on this poetry progress of mine. And I was introduced by David at that reading. At that time, I decided that I would not do a standard reading surveying what ultimately has turned out to be 6 sections of my book. Instead, I want to express my gratitude for the scholarship that researchers like you have undertaken so that we creative writers can utilize, or shall we say steal, your material as inspiration for our work. Today, I will provide an updated version of how your efforts can have creative consequences for others, which you may not realize. My first piece has something to do with the diaspora, created when young single men left their homes in China to immigrate to Hawaii to find work, typically for years. You scholars probably know more than me about the abnormal societies that were created on both sides of the ocean, the sojourner bachelors here and the waiting families back in the villages. For today, I'm just going to share one poem about the diaspora, but it will be more in the background. I had been reading Janice Stockard's book, Daughters of the Canton Delta, which I assume some of you are familiar with. At one point, she interviewed an old lady from Hotel Village. I got goosebumps because my grandmother was from that very village. The families there apparently had an unusual marriage custom. The eldest child had to get married, then the second, etc., just like Shakespeare's Taming of the Shrew. So no skipping in line. There was a failsafe in that if the daughter next in line did not get married, the family could force her to become a spinster, formally take a vow to not marry. She would get to wear her hair in a bun as a mark of her new status. For those who know Cantonese, Stockard used the term "bikuri sohe." I took this unique custom and imagined a young woman who had to face such a life-changing decision. The spinsters. Increasing remittances presaged his return. Bowler hat, large leather trunk, a pocket watch on a chain. It was a sudden cloudburst after a season of drought. The family was overjoyed. Finally, heaven's blessings. A pig was slaughtered for the homecoming. Neighbors flocked like cranes at dawn to gawk and shake their heads in wonder at objects never seen before. Soon matchmakers descended upon the village, iridescent dragonflies hovering above a fecund pond. One quietly scurried over to the next big town to secure the most captivating maiden, whom everyone exclaimed was a pink lily in full bloom. The troth was sealed, but for one protocol, for his elder sister was still unmarried. She herself had once been promised to another sojourner to these islands, but he had succumbed to the white demon gods there. His spirit then could never return. Her family had to break off the engagement. Her spring turned into summer, hot and arid, and the stream of eligible men dwindled to a trickle. Her parents prevailed upon this eldest child to make way for her younger brother, to leave their home as a spinster. They promised to build her a small house next to theirs, which she would inherit as her share of the family property, and where, after death, her tablet would be placed. All her life, this eldest sister was told to work hard, that her sacrifices were for the good of the family. Washing clothes and carrying out the night soil seemed like her primary lot in the world, even as the boys played games by the stream. She was not favored by fate, she realized, and perhaps her parents offered her the best way out. Whether unripe and bitter or crawling with bugs, the persimmon in hand was still edible. With a little deliberation, she took her oath of celibacy. She donned a skirt, combed back her bangs, and for the first time tied her hair into a bun. When the newlyweds were married, she sat in front of them, poised, prepared to drink their tea. A year later, her brother sailed back to the islands, leaving the village and his pregnant wife behind. He had intended to send for her at the next opportunity, but she died in childbirth, her midwives wailing. The baby survived to be cared for by her aunt. Sorrow embraced the new father. An ocean became a moat surrounding his heart. It was a white memory better to be forgotten by all, although money was still sent back for the few remaining years his parents were still alive. He never returned home and married a native woman with whom he raised many sons. His orphaned daughter grew up with his deep-set eyes and her mother's long, deft fingers. The quiet resolve, though, was nurtured by her aunt, whom the young woman chose to follow. This was the family she knew. Together they shared the small house and the vow to remain unmarried for the rest of their lives. The next section of my book features the work early Apake were involved with in Hawaii. Two pieces were a result of history books that can be obtained at the Hawaii Chinese History Center in Chinatown. The first poem is based on a family memoir written by the descendants of Lugon, who in that period leased the local Honolulu, an already established native Hawaiian fish pond near Pearl Harbor from the John E. estate. He paid an annual rent of $1,200 plus 18 crabs and 6 mullet. I stole the details of Lou's enterprise, what he called Singlei, for his poem entitled A Hard Night's Work. At midnight, under the rising moon, you row your small boat to the deep end of the pond, closer to the seawall, laying out your linen net in an elongated crescent. Then from the shallows, in front of the mouth of the crescent, you zigzag back and forth, banging your pole on the side of your boat and smacking your paddle against the flat surface of the water. You shout at the top of your lungs, rousing the sleeping fish. They bolt into your net, which you pull up end to end, your hand over fist. You make fast work of plucking out the fatter fish snagged by their gills. Quickly, you lay out your net again and haul in another catch, and then another and another, until your boat sits low in the water, until the fish piled beside you weigh as much as you do. They gasp for air, and you take deep breaths. Back on shore, you wash down your boat, stretch out your net to dry across large racks, and sort the fish into their proper bamboo baskets to be driven into town to be sold in the morning. Some are as long as your arm, some have tapered snouts and rasping teeth, and others bulge with their eyes so clear you can peer into them and foresee your own hard death. Only then do you rest, lying on your back beside the pond. You listen to the waves lapping the limestone and gaze up at the stars, tens of thousands of tiny silver fingerlings shimmering in the vast dark ocean. But you are fast asleep before dawn. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor, this and other fish ponds in the vicinity were filled in. It is now, I believe, in the area of the Ted Makalena golf course. HCHC also published a book on Maui Chinese families, and I found one of them on Chung Kong Yu of Lahaina. It was very intriguing how his family all worked together, turning taro into poi for sale. This is the inspiration for my poem entitled Poi Factory. Our family worked in shifts and took different chores. Eldest sister and I woke up before dawn to prepare the day's meals for everyone. I also collected the kiawe from the shed and the water we needed for the steamer. My father and mother knew several languages spoken in our neighborhood and greeted the farmers who arrived throughout the day. They came with their mule cots loaded with heavy burlap bags full of taro. We scrubbed off the mud and fibers and placed the corms on wooden racks in our oven. Younger brother and younger sister were responsible for tending to the coal fire, making sure the pan of water was kept boiling, but also that it did not evaporate out. They took turns as well, wetting down the canvas draped over the oven. The corms, which had been steamed from the day before, were gathered up by my uncle and elder brothers. They peeled off the poisonous skin and with the stone hammers pounded the taro. Some liked to buy just the mash. For others, we needed in water to sell as paste. All of us helped to pack the poi into smaller cloth bags weighing 5 pounds each. These were picked up by peddlers who then spread out on chosen routes to call on households across our valley. Sometimes some of us took breaks to eat a midday snack, though not all at the same time. Whenever one task needed more hands, there were enough of us who dropped our own work to help out. Only when the sun was setting did we all sit down together for dinner, and then we went to bed, except for our parents, who stayed up by the kerosene lamp to settle the accounts and plan for the next day, which turned out to be the same as every other day, year in and year out, until I left home to get married. I also did research on my own family history. My grandfather operated a general store opposite A'ala Park in Chinatown. I was able to dig up records in the INS archives at San Bruno, and with a few family stories and even a school essay my father wrote, I pieced together enough details to describe a store plausibly existing in my imaginary Chinatown. In the store, the rumors about the fight at the sugar mill swirl around the saltfish and traveler's plums, the sleek sausages hanging under the open transoms, the dried scallops, fat medallions of gold sorted by origin in wicker baskets. A barber comes in early to buy some young ginger, but stays a while to chat with the school teacher's petite wife who is looking for peanut oil. Before she leaves, she coaxes her toddler to recite a quatrain out loud. All the uncles applaud, and the little girl gets to choose a rock candy from the tall glass jar under the counter. In the far corner of the courtyard, beside blue bundles of fishing lines and nets, a letter writer at his table listens patiently as the house painter relates the death of his brother. The two agree, however, to omit any mention to his widow of how he had died of opium poisoning. As the two get up to leave, a kinsman who raises ducks by the marshes presses a small coin without a word into the painter's gaunt hand. At the long counter, the taro farmer arranges with the owner to settle his accounts. He confesses the work in the fields is too harsh, and he must return to care for his ailing wife. The government postman arrives with a thin envelope addressed to a stonecutter in care of the store. It is placed inside a locked drawer behind the main counter and will be picked up by an old man when he and his native wife stop in as usual the next Sunday. At noon, a clerk is sent out to buy vegetables. Another clerk doubles as the cook, and everyone eats their lunches discreetly, standing at their stations. They leave the scraps for the pair of calico cats, just enough to keep them coming around, but not enough to stop their hunt for rats. Rather than losing it again, a gambler sends his night's winnings to his mother. The cashier collects his money and will mail a coded letter back to the village where an elder holds a chest of silver for the store. The purveyor of bean curd pudding asks to barter for this week's delivery. Instead of cash, he will exchange his whole freshly made bucket for their best grade of tobacco. Surrounded by large tins of assorted tea in the storeroom off the kitchen, the owner's son fills out the manifest and shipper's declarations in between his English school assignments. Rice growers gather in their wide front lanai to complain about the sparrows, dark flocks swooping, devouring their crops. A few talk about buying a scattergun as a last resort. In the mezzanine, where they keep imported abalone and decades-old tangerine peels, the fugitive and his supporters, heads bowed, murmur softly in earnest discussion about the next rally. Clerks later on clear out a space for a card table among the displays of kitchen crockery. After work, the owner and his buddies will stick around for a night of gin rummy. Newly arrived, a teenager is introduced all around, where he is from, whom he is related to, what manner of work he has done. The old-timers take in his every word about home. In the 1930s, a sociologist named Paul Siu interviewed dozens of Chinese laundrymen in the Chicago area. This study turned into his wonderful book, The Chinese Laundryman. Much of this work is in the voices of the men candidly talking story about their lives, their hard work, their loneliness, their few pleasures. In the book, Siu provided a floor plan of a typical laundry, and I used this as a guide to write my next poem, The Laundryman. You would think our work would be fresh and clean, bathed as we are in soap and water. But I can only see in front of me the day's crumpled shirts full of sweat and grime, the urine-stained underwear and mud-splattered pants, napkins smeared with food and drink, sometimes bedsheets with menstrual blood or handkerchiefs caked in snot, all gathering in the humid air in small spent piles in the back room. They will need to be steeped in hot water and scrubbed over the washboard, then cranked through stiff rollers to be wrung out to dry and pressed down flat by a sad iron straight from the stove. Only later, as eyes adjust to night, can they be fluffed and folded, wrapped in rice paper, neatly tied into separate bundles and placed on a shelf behind the counter. Only then will they be ready, waiting for you to pick up at your leisure. In the old days, some young girls were sold by their families to work for others. Julia Flynn Seiler, in her book, The White Devil's Daughters, writes, Mui Jai means little sister in Cantonese dialect, and refers to children who would become household slaves. So I tried to imagine the life of one of them in this next poem. Little sister. My grandfather did not like me because I was not a boy. My mother said to give me up since I was an extra mouth to feed. My father quickly sold me off to cover all his gambling debts. My paper father bought me since he knew a way to bring me over. An immigration man let me in as they gave him enough silver. My paper mother called me little sister, but I served her as a house slave. But then they sold me once again because I had become too old. The brothel keeper bought me because I was still so young. One man paid a bonus for the privilege of being my first. Other men kept paying for me because they had no wives here. And even later, they still visited, although I had fallen sick. I died a short while later because I could not afford the herbs. I never had a funeral as no one had the money for it. My body is buried in an unmarked grave, as if I had not lived at all. A whole section of my collection are poems about the notorious Chinatown fire of 1900. In December of the previous year, a Chinaman was discovered to have died from the bubonic plague. Since the Black Death was then widespread in China, the authorities in Hawaii quarantined all of Chinatown with a lockdown imposed, preventing anyone from going in or out. They also instituted controlled burns of any building where new victims of the plague were found. Unfortunately, on January 20th, 1900, one burn got out of control, causing a conflagration that consumed 16 blocks of this thriving neighborhood. A detailed account of this event, which occurred nearly 125 years ago, can be found in James Moore's book, Plague and Fire. What made the writing of these poems most relevant was that I wrote them during the first years of our COVID pandemic. I'm going to read The Fire. The health board condemns the shanties as someone inside has died from the plague. Other inhabitants are summarily evicted, gathering whatever they can, but with nowhere to go. The fire department surrounds the perimeter, poised with their hoses for the start of the burn. A crowd converges, curious, angry, and resigned, and worried that they themselves will be next. The fire is ignited as rehearsed, but unexpected gusts come down from the valley. Firemen vainly try to contain its spread. People are stunned, immobile, uncertain about what to do. Before long, embers billow up, wafted by the wind, and jump from rooftop to rooftop. Residents rush to stamp out spot fires, tearing down even their own houses to form fire breaks. Narrow alleyways turn into gauntlets of flame. A fireball scours the street, combusting all in its path. Faces are blistered, hair singed wide, eyes wide from fear. Everyone is shouting, drowning out the chaos. A store selling fireworks for the new year explodes. A lumber yard blazes. A few run home to retrieve gold or papers. Most, though, just flee with the clothes on their backs. Inexorably, the inferno marches towards the wards. It melts electric coils and a hastily abandoned fire engine. Volunteers carry on their backs women with bound feet. Opium addicts, delirious, are rescued from their den. Refugees try to escape the conflagration, wanting to cross the bridge over the stream. But quarantine militia, pick handles ready, block their way, leaving them to huddle in a no man's land to wait. Sparks fly into the steeple of the church. Soon it becomes a furnace, consuming its beams. Unsupported, its bells crash into the sanctuary below. All of Chinatown hears this dirge. As a footnote, you might know that the church mentioned was Kamakapili Church, which is now located next to Tamashiro Market. But its original location was in Chinatown. According to the 1900 census, the ratio of Chinese men to women was about 6.5 to 1. So for companionship, some bachelors turn to prostitutes. I learned from an article by Joan Horry, a librarian at UH Manoa, that many of the latter were Japanese, unlike the so-called wives of 100 men in California, who were Chinese. So I wanted to write a piece from the point of view of one of these women, perhaps thinking it would be more of an authentic voice. I envisioned her thinking to herself in traditional Japanese haiku, so I wrote English versions, that is, short poems of 3 lines of 5 and then 7 and then 5 syllables. This is called "The Chinese Were the Best Customers." I sit patiently, my kimono neatly pressed, ready to disrobe. These Chinamen stink, their breaths, their clothes, their pigtails, even their money. One man, $1, beat stripping cane in the sun for 35 cents. A long row of sheds, look into the glass window. I am with the lamp. After his druckings, he stays on top, hugging me. I am his comfort. I don't look like them. I am not their village girls, yet they visit me. In this port city, we accept every coin. I serve as a bank. Mother taught me shame, but naked is what I trade. I now sell my breasts. I ask for a break. I must hunt under the bed for my jar of lard. Sipping tea outside, I hear songs from my homeland. My neighbor is sad. Today I'm bleeding, so do kitchen work instead. Glad there is no child. I love papayas, but cannot shop at one stall. The man's face turns red. The gaunt old-timer scrimped and saved for months on end, but can't get it up. At home, pigs do it. I am not any different, one more animal. But what can she do? She frets over her swelling, that it will be dark. Pake always smile. Kanaka will tip their hats. My people, they'll sneer. I was pretty once. Men were chasing after me. Now I wait for them. The clerk bings a knife and lays it next to my head, savoring my fear. The chef's wife arrived. He waited for her for years, so will come no more. We pay off the cops, but this one wants even more, so I am his tip. Our owner slaps me. I have nowhere else to go. I hoard my complaints. I open my trunk. The camphor stirs memories. Mother's pressed flower. Covered in makeup, a phantom haunts my mirror, the white of morning. Again, as a footnote, the brothels at that time were all located in the Chinatown area along Hawai'i River and Nu'uanu streets. Those streets are still there in Chinatown today. Many other Pake made the decision to marry native Hawaiian women, settling down and starting families here. Again, I wanted to write a poem from the point of view of a young woman, trying to get into her head, seeing if I could think and speak in her language. I turned to Mary Kawena Pukui's Olelo Noeau, her indispensable collection of Hawaiian sayings. Early on, I discovered a multitude of phrases about sex, which fit into my idea that my two protagonists' first attraction was physical. So for this poem, I appropriated 20 Hawaiian idioms or slang words, plus about 10 Chinese ones. I will defer to the linguistic scholars in the audience to say whether this effort was successful. A wife reminisces. I bore him sons and also daughters, and though we love our children, we loved making them even more. Or so it seemed in those frantic young days before we were married, before we called ourselves husband and wife, the dragon and phoenix, the needle and the flowers making sweet lay. In those days, we were like fledglings hiding in the bosom of the banana grove where the valley walls start their steep climb. As soon as we were out of sight, he would be at my breast, my hands yanking down his pants in one swoop, our bodies twisting and falling like fishhooks entangled, like wrestlers caught in a deathly hold. We would find that so-worn spot on the ground. He would cut a few large leaves to place under me so my back would not get scratched. We did little talking, our alien tongues busy elsewhere, like our grasping hands, our swollen thighs. Often we would snuggle together on our sides, he at my back nibbling on my earlobes, long ones, which he believed foretold my longevity, driving me to distraction, like an eel. I would engulf his cane stalk, nursing his sweet juices, or he would enter me from behind into the depths of my sand crab hold, quickly, as if seized by our fear that if this were all to life, we still could never get enough of it. At other times, he would sickle my nipple for what seemed like half a day, and my breast would open up like wide eyes. I loved his rump, smooth as the moon, his curve without a flaw, like the curl of a perfect wave, self-contained and mesmerizing. I often raked my fingernails there, marking furrows in his skin. I always marveled at his resilience. I taught him secret names from my body parts, and his eyes, unwavering, would follow me as I spread out beneath him like a pool. Like a breadfruit blossom, my buds stood erect, waiting for his snout to root and prod. I was the chili pepper burning his dark lips. He drank me like a gushing spring, feigning shyness as he leaned over, wiping his mouth to whisper about my taste, salty and wet. I made it a point to fix my eyes on his as I came, or I tried to, wild and gleaming, then turning glazed at the point of no return, to carry him up into my dreams. All I wanted was to live those heedless moments as if our little deaths would never die. We resolved to live together, two large rocks standing in a forlorn sea. His friends thought him crazy from too much sex and feared that he would never return then to his land of flowers. My mother banished me, even after he recited the proper speech I taught him to say. He was, she warned, a vagrant, trespassing our protected sea, a plover who, when his breast turned dark, would fly away. The gourds were broken, never to be mended. Like lovers of old, we snatched embers from the fire to scar our skin as medals of our troth. We rode side saddle to the other side of the mountains and lived by ourselves. I taught him how to swim. He taught me how to sew. We taught each other the kisses neither of us thought we knew. We farmed and foraged by day. At dusk I danced my hula, and he showed me secret martial arts sets passed down from his heroes of long ago. We would save our candle nuts, and as the moon rose, we would lie outside our lean-to, making love in the owl's light, the fingertips of the mountain breeze tickling our skin. Together we gathered pomegranates and mountain apples in the shade. We had our babies soon after, and our days became filled with me and my stout belly leaning over my taro patch, and he and our beloved chasing after his pigs. But we would still have our moments when we would bring our small ones to bathe at the mouth of the river where it meets the sea, our naked bodies, dark as lava, glistening, one sitting behind the other in turn to braid each other's newly washed hair. Often our Chinese American histories in books and museums are presented in an overly positive way, all about all of our accomplishments, notwithstanding the hard red clay of the plantations, the exclusion acts, racist lockdowns, and other challenges. The emphasis on our success, reinforcing our model minority status. So it was refreshing to read Clarence Glick's seminal work on our pioneer generations in Hawaii, Sojourners and Settlers, which was based on his interviews of our old-timers in the 1930s. Glick, a longtime UH professor, did not shy away from writing about their conflicts, betrayals, foibles, and dilemmas. So I wrote a series of prose vignettes, influenced in part by Glick's stories, adding a few other incidents recorded by CKIE, the founder of City Mill, Patrick Anderson, who wrote about the relationship between Sun Yat-sen and Robert Wilcox, and others. This is entitled Tyrannies. Mo and Zane each had 2 shares in the dressmaker's shop, and Uncle Strong had 1. All of them knew how to cut and sew, but Mo was the most adept and took on the specialized tasks like the button work. Zane was also outgoing and greeted customers at the counter. He was good at numbers and so kept the books. Uncle Strong helped with the finishings and cooked their meals. In the evenings, they all slept together in the back room. At the end of every week, the money left in the cash box was tallied. After keeping a small working reserve, the balance was divided up among the three of them according to their shares. One day, Mo discovered Zane had been taking out cash for personal expenses, especially dinners with friends. Mo and Uncle Strong could not trust their partner anymore. It felt like a stain on a piece of lustrous satin that could not be removed. The business was sold, and the sales proceeds, after an adjustment for Zane's advances, was then distributed, though they did not get back all of their initial investment. Mo was hurt. He had been betrayed. He stopped working for a while, trying to consider his next move. It was a very awkward situation. Whenever he went to the clubhouse, Zane was also there. Mo tried to be civil, but could not bear to see him. It was a weight on his back, forcing him to hunch over. He held to a moral code, which meant he could no longer frequent the place. He had not done anything wrong, he believed, but he was the one who had to sacrifice. The white demon health inspector loved his fish. He knew how to look for the blood in their gills, the clear, bulging eyes, and the firmness of their flesh. Still, these dreaming of the sea he would pass. His task was to find any damaged ones, or those caught many days ago, which he would have to confiscate as spoiled. Everyone agreed that he was good at this job, but he also took advantage of his authority. When he came to our market next to the harbor, he invariably confiscated one healthy fish as well. The owners of the stalls knew it was just a way for him to get an extra meal for himself. They were unable to stop him, for they feared even worse consequences if they protested. The inspector was clever. He did not pick on just one owner. On his inspections, he chose a fish from a different stall each time to spread around his corruption. Although they knew the government here was considering a law forbidding the practice, the Siu family strongly believed they needed to bind their daughter's feet. It was for her own good. Her lotus feet would make her more desirable for any husband, either here or even better back in their village if they were fortunate enough to return. So when she turned 5, her parents kept beautiful crystal indoors, a silkworm swathed in her plump cocoon. Secretly, they started wrapping her feet with cloth bandages to break the toes and in time the arches. Unfortunately, the girl was frail and unable to suffer constant pain. She cried all the time, loud enough to alert the neighbors as to what was going on. The authorities were called. It was too late. The girl's feet had become infected, her jaw locked, and she passed away. There are always spies from our homeland. Those who we knew were here, even though we did not know who they were. They were like bugs in the ground or in the air, smaller than the eye could see, ready to do us harm. Somehow they found out that Guok headed a clandestine group determined to overthrow their government. Guok had worked deliberately to become a naturalized citizen of these islands and had brought over his wife and children. He thought he would be safe from any reprisals, but the authorities learned of Guok's activities and caused the magistrate of his home district to seize his village temple. They sent word that they would remove the names of his family from the genealogical records. It was, he understood, a real threat, and he readily paid a ransom. Although he was still sympathetic to the revolutionary cause, Guok resigned his position to signal his surrender. It was nearing the end of the year, and everyone was working hard to pay off their debts in time. Chinatown was like a harbor full of boats, all trying to make it back to the docks before nightfall. Old Chu, the respected merchant, was one of them, but suddenly he died. Business associates were immediately worried, as Old Chu owed many of them large sums of money. They themselves had loans coming due and had been counting on being paid off by Old Chu so that they could in turn meet their own obligations. After his well-attended funeral, his friends met and tried to find where Ochu might have hidden some assets. But if there was anything set aside, they could not find it. Instead, there was a growing suspicion that Ochu had borrowed much more than he could ever repay. Maybe it was speculated that that was why he fell victim to a heart attack. Everyone turned to the heads of the Benevolent Association, the umbrella organization for all of our societies, to discuss what to do. In the end, his lenders had to agree to write off half of what Ochu owed them. 3 other merchants then stepped in with enough cash to cover the balance. We all had to assume a share of this loss to avert an even worse cascade of bankruptcies. It was the only way for the entire community to save face. We of the 3rd, 4th, and 5th generations can trace our ancestries to old-timers who were able to marry Chinese or native Hawaiian women. Yet there were so many others who were not so lucky and who died without progeny and are largely now forgotten about. Decades ago, I read C.K. Young's work on Chinese folk religions. It helped me put into perspective some of what our family and other local Chinese were practicing, things that were different from the so-called 3 classic religions of China. Central to Yang's work was the importance of ancestor worship, which by definition requires descendants to pay tribute and offer supplication. Unfortunately for old bachelors, this created an existential predicament. I'm next going to read a poem about Qingming, or the Tomb Sweeping Festival, based on how our family celebrated it. Again, it is set 125 years ago, with old-timers paying respects to their elders who have passed away. But I should note that for this poem, I added another dimension, a narrator who at the end offers a second opinion on the proceedings, once every year. Every spring, these pigtailers make their way to the back of this valley, up to this cemetery where old-timers are buried. They come sometimes in groups of 3 or 4, or maybe 10 or 20, to gather around one grave or another, dotting the slope of the sun-drenched hill. Young and old, the men are dressed in their finest, starched shirts and pants, and hats to shade their eyes. They carry incense and red candles to light in front of the headstones, lay out a few bowls of food, and burn colored paper, perhaps even set off a pack of firecrackers to summon the spirits. They believe their ancestors are still alive, or at least their essences are, and reappear in this season where their bodies now lie. This is why the living need to serve whole chickens, fish, sometimes tofu or shrimp, or even roast suckling pig, the color of blood oranges, for these ghosts to eat. They cut away the overgrowth around the graves, fill in holes where any soil has washed away, sometimes scrub the headstones clean, repainting the names in black. At some point, they decide they are ready, and each in turn stands facing the grave, clasping hand over fist, heads bowed, offering prayers out loud, talking story with the dead. Then they gather up whatever they have brought, but not before slicing out generous cubes of pork, breaking off a fish head or some chicken wings, and finally pouring out an extra cup of tea or clear liquid. These tributes are placed behind the headstones, spread out directly on top of the grave mounds, sharing the bounties of this world with those who bestow them from the next. All of this we observe from our perches within the banyan tree, waiting for the sun to set. When everyone has gone, we then swoop down like minor birds, large bags in hand, sneaking over to these graves, their candles burnt down, the husk of spent firecrackers strewn about the singed grass to retrieve the food left on the ground. We take them home to feast on with gratitude once every year. The urge to return to the homeland was paramount throughout the diaspora. As pointed out by Clarence Glick and others, if an old-timer could not do so while alive, he could arrange for his bones to eventually be disinterred and repatriated, thereby joining his ancestors with his own name on a tablet in the family shrine. My next poem is about the famous bone houses, which served as temporary repositories for the bones of the dead while waiting for transportation arrangements to be finalized. Once again, however, I have employed a narrator who offers his own opinion at the end. The caretaker. Atop the hill, you can see the open palm of the ocean, brilliant with the promise of sunset. This rapture is not meant for my eyes, but for these bones disinterred, now brittle as volcanic glass, bathed with gin and wrapped in rice paper, feet apart, arms apart, the spine, the hard skull on top, arranged as if squatting inside tall crocks, sealed and shelved one by one in this clench of false houses. They are all my brothers awaiting their returns. Theirs is an unnatural will, a vain seduction. What I have left will soon become mud, a shadow of the snarl, in the snarl of roots and worms, my breath, my blood, these calloused hands, my hair turned pale as ghosts. One day the heat of this valley will claim me, fish ponds below, our irrigation through these mountains, these taro leaves conferring. David Hinton has written about the influence of Taoism and Chan Buddhism on ancient Chinese and even contemporary Western poetry. I've tried to incorporate some of his ideas on man's integral connection with nature in this last poem, imagining an old-timer becoming a recluse in the mountains in his last days. This is entitled Within the Dragon's Breath. When I first arrived inside the heart of the valley, the morning mist still enshrouded the mountaintops, their fluted cliffs, a dance of sunlight and shadows surrounding our patchwork of jade green farms like a tomb. Years of taro and mud indeed drained my life force, a lotus once blossoming as an unquenchable fire. I retreated up to the ridgeline, my clothes ragged, the small of my back a gnarl of knots and woes. Now I huddle in my hut beneath a stand of sandalwood. At dawn, I awaken to birds calling to their mates. I am everywhere engulfed by clouds, and in the dim light, all of my senses are alert. At these times, the only thing that matters is the present, within the dragon's breath, billowing, unfurling, sometimes damp and dense, sometimes effervescent, and then in a flash, this fog is gone. Instead, below, my eyes follow the far river as it spills out like the arms of a lover outstretched into the sea, into the hard blue of the ocean, and in expiry into the land of our ancestors beyond. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nathan. It's always a treat to hear context behind the poems from the writer himself. So we'll transition into a brief audience Q&A and then to snacks after. We have about 10 minutes, so if you have any questions, please raise your hand and we will field them. Questions?
Yes, David.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how the book evolved as you were writing. I remember when you were talking about it 4 years ago. I don't know if you had the complete idea in mind then, if it changed over time, if it expanded.
The first poem that I wrote that's in this book was started around 1990, 1991. And I wrote a few poems off and on until about 1997. So it was about 10 or 12 poems, perhaps. And I wasn't thinking of this as a book or anything. It's just lucky to have a few poems written. But in 1997, I got distracted by Iris Chang's The Rape of Nanking. And so I started writing exclusively about the Nanjing Massacre for 15 years. So from 1997 to 2012, I just wrote about the Nanjing Massacre, and I put away any other poems. So after that, around 2015, I was doing a family history with some of my cousins, and I found out that I had enough material to maybe try a poem, and that turned out to be the one that was called In the Store, about my grandfather's store. So I started that and finished that poem, and I said, oh, maybe I can look up some other material and start writing poems about this particular period in the 1900s in Honolulu, Chinatown. And so that's what I did. And then exclusively for 8 years, I was only writing poems in this particular series. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, Ken.
How, like, over the years, Chinatown has really been changing, right? So is there anything that popped up in your head? I know, just the whole atmosphere of Chinatown. You worked on Chinatown, so.
Well, it has changed a lot since 125 years, which is the period of this particular book. And it's gone through its ups and downs, especially during World War II, and then after that, also during the statehood period, and frankly, a decline starting in the 1970s. So there's a lot that has happened since the period that I'm talking about, and I don't know. I'm not sure that I can comment too much about it or write too many poems about these other periods. It's too complex to try to write more about Chinatown in these other time periods. It's really complex. Maybe somebody else in the audience will take up on this project and write poems about other eras of Honolulu, Chinatown.
One more question.
Yeah, my books are for sale. Lizzie is there, $20. You have a question? Yes.
Yeah, have you ever explored like the old photographs of Chinatown and Honolulu to like give you atmosphere or anything like that?
Yes, I have. And I want to recommend Gary Coover's book on Honolulu, Chinatown, which has a lot of photographs. And you can also go to this Hawaii State Archives as well. I've tried to look at those online, especially for inspiration, but frankly speaking, I couldn't really find anything that would inspire me to write a poem, but I did try to look at those just to get background information. There's a story about these guys on the front cover, which are also in the Hawaii State Archives. So I was more interested in the people than in the buildings of the period. And so that's why I chose people rather than, some of the street scenes. Like there are a lot of street scenes about the fire that we can see, but you can't really see people's faces that well. And there are other photographs of people in the state archives, which were more interesting for me than the street scenes.
Actually, we do have time for one more question, but that clock is fast on the screen, so. Actually, I have a question. Yes. So the documentary materials you work with, some of them are pretty harrowing historical truths and heartbreaking stories. What was your emotional process like, turning them into poems and just kind of looking them over and over again?
I mentioned a little bit about how some of these old timers got forgotten about, especially if they didn't have any family and descendants. And so what I've tried to do is to try to give voice to those people who are now forgotten about. And that was actually the motive that I had with my Nanjing Massacre book, because there's so many people that died as victims of that particular atrocity. And nobody is able to tell their stories. And so I tried to give voice to those people who suffered and died at that time. So I guess I'm still doing the same things, trying to tell other people's stories, but especially for those people who are unable to do so now, and are not lucky enough to have descendants to tell their stories for them.
Anyone online?
Anyone on Zoom have questions? Well, it is being recorded and people can marinate it in later too by rewatching it. But thank you to the 25 participants we have on Zoom and everyone who came in person. Like Wayne said, the book is on sale at the back, and we will continue the conversation more informally outside of the hallway with the snacks again provided by the Center for Chinese Studies. So please stay around, hang out with us, ask questions. And also there should be a clipboard with the EALL Talk sign-in sheet somewhere. If you haven't signed in, please put your name on it. It's not like a listserv sign-up sheet, it's just so that we know how many people showed up to our event. So please sign in, and yeah, we'll see you in the hallway right outside. Thank you again, Wing Peng.
Thank you.